Salvete, Flavia Secunda nomen meum, olivete virum haburet. What? You don't understand me? Excuse me, Latin is the language of business here in this part of the empire, but I can also speak your language, so I begin again. Greetings, my name is Flavia Secunda. My husband and I own an excellent olive grove some 3 days' journey from here. We have always sold our olives to the Dominus, the master of this business called a latifundium. Our olives have always been of excellent quality, but my husband died. He left no sons or other heirs behind, so I now own the olive grove. The master knew my husband well and has always been generous to us. Now that my husband is gone, the master has invited me to visit him, to discuss the possibility of my selling him the grove. It's a long trip. I am old. The master will allow me to stay overnight as a guest in one of the rooms here in the villa, and to join his wife and family not only in the bath, but to meet with him afterwards in his presence chamber to discuss the possibility of a sale. Afterwards, I will join him and his wife for a midday meal tomorrow, before I begin the long journey back to the grove. I have been told that he has made excellent improvements to this villa, and I look forward to seeing them. But here is the villa entrance. Let me tell you about it as we visit, today with other friends on the Armchair Traveler. Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Judy, and I love travel, history, and I'm always curious about how people lived in the past. Today we're going to visit part of the Villa Romana del Casale, a UNESCO World Heritage Site located in east central Sicily, about 90 minutes or so by bus from Catania. This was the home in what we would call the corporate headquarters of a very large Roman imperial-era agricultural estate. We'll see the monumental entrance, which was built to impress, a few of the excavated public rooms, and part of the bath complex. This is going to be a two-parter, so come back to see the second half, including some of the private rooms next time. You can learn more about my channel and my website on the addresses shown here. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share to help my channel grow. Now let's go inside for part one of the visit, today on the Armchair Traveler. I have traveled for 3 days by carriage, mostly along a paved Roman road. The trip seemed long, but it was safe. Roman justice gave me safety in exchange for the taxes we pay. The area is hilly and quite rocky, but the road is straight and level as the engineers could manage. I will allow my servant to tell you the rest of our story, as her grasp of your language is far better than mine. Flavia traveled, most likely by carriage, along a graded and paved Roman road between her home 3 days distant to the villa. The area in this part of Sicily is quite rocky and hilly, but the road, which was built by military engineers and craftsmen, was designed to be straight, level, and long-lasting. When she came close to the villa, she would have seen the gates. This rather pleasant modern paved walkway leads you downhill to the archaeological site. The key thing for you to notice is that it did lead downhill. Archaeologists tell us that much of the villa was destroyed by a mudslide. What they don't know for sure is whether the present site was always below the grade of the rest of the surrounding area, or whether 2 millennia of mudslides built up the area around it. In late antiquity, the Romans partitioned most of the Sicilian hinterland, where we are now, into huge agricultural estates called latifundia. These estates specialized in agriculture designed for sale and export. Grain, olive oil, and wine were all produced, some for use in Sicily, but much of it destined for Rome itself. The latifundia were the closest approximation to industrialized agriculture in antiquity, but their economics depended on slavery. The villa was the center of a much larger estate. No one knows yet how big this one was, although clearly it must have extended for miles. Just the mosaic floors that they have unearthed cover an area of 3,500 square meters. The villa itself must have been much larger. This is the monumental entryway, only partially restored, and it was clearly meant to impress anyone who saw it. Archaeologists and historians tell us that what we can see today initially was a far more modest establishment. This was a less lavish country home and business place for the original estate owners, and probably dated from the Roman conquest of Sicily. Over time, the owner and his family and heirs sold goods to Rome, grew rich, bought more land, making it possible with careful management to grow even richer. The villa we see today dates from the 4th and 5th centuries and came complete with a lavish bath complex, which was open to the public, and a basilica where the owner, who we'll call the master from now on, held court, and eventually resembled a small town more than it did a home. One theory is that in the 4th century AD, this area was owned by a single Roman, perhaps a member of the Roman Imperial Senate, who used it not only as his home, but as a business center. A second competing theory suggests that the villa was eventually controlled by the empire directly as a satellite capital, perhaps for the area, and perhaps as a home for a member of the imperial family itself. No matter which theory proves to be true, the original monumental entrance of the Villa Romana del Casale would be your first stop and was clearly meant to impress anyone who arrived at the villa, whether invited guests of the master of the estate, people who needed to do business with the master of the estate in his position as estate owner and possibly a local ruler, or local people who worked on the estate and just wanted to use the baths and latrines. While we have a pretty good idea of what the entryway might have looked like, all trace of doors, gates, and barriers have disappeared. This was, however, a very valuable establishment, and doors or gates of some kind, almost certainly made out of bronze, which would have long ago been pillaged and melted down, or possibly bronze-clad wood, had to have been there. The estate lingered on and apparently prospered after the fall of the Western Empire in 476 AD. There's some evidence that after that time, surrounding walls and gates giving entry to the villa were strengthened to preserve the master and the inhabitants from marauding thieves and brigands. Even then, however, arriving visitors, whether people who wanted to do business with the owner or private guests of the family, were probably met by slaves who opened up whatever doors there were and welcomed them into the outer courtyard you see here. The area was probably at least partially covered to shade it from the sun. This area was paved, perhaps with marble. You can see it in the bottom of the photograph, although I can't tell by just looking. The remainder of the area is paved by what appears to have been sandstone, perhaps more recently put in place. Notice how the pavement slopes downward from the columns toward the center, shown in the lower left of the photo. This area might have held a pool, easily refilled by rain, and perhaps a fountain. Only the footprint of whatever was here is still visible, as a lighter colored and indented area shown in the lower left of the courtyard photo. From this courtyard, a visitor or guest could proceed up a couple of steps into a vestibule where a more formal welcome awaited, and into the peristyle, or if from the general public, into an anteroom that led into the baths. This map comes from the English language guide to the site. The area shown shaded in light purple to the top left of the map includes the entire bath complex, which as you can see is quite large. The public might enter this complex from the courtyard we just visited through a passage from the courtyard itself. Notice that to the side at number 14 is a public lavatory. Invited guests, on the other hand, would have climbed up some steps to the vestibule and entered the peristyle. From there, they could make their way to the bath complex via an antechamber, number 20 on our map, which had its own private lavatory to the side. In Roman architecture, the bath and lavatory functions were always separate. They didn't have all-in-one bathrooms like we do. The architectural layout is still a bit speculative, but from the current interpretation, the general public couldn't use the private facility. Roman baths could be quite elaborate. A bath was an important part of daily life in ancient Rome. All classes of Roman society took daily hot baths, although not necessarily at the same time or place. If the family quarters here had a private bath, it had not been uncovered when I visited, so the family and guests would have used this bath complex as well, which might partly account for the lavish decoration. To make these areas functional as well as attractive, they needed a way to heat the water in the interior rooms. In a pinch, slaves could carry buckets of boiling water to pools or tubs, but that wouldn't have helped with the cold air in the room. Historians think a Turkish king named Arzawa actually set up a heating system much like this as long ago as 1300 BCE, but it was the Romans who grabbed onto and improved this idea and used heating in the floors and walls as well, thereby creating the first central heating system ever. Most bath complexes were thermal, although sometimes they relied on hot springs. They were cited to take maximum advantage of the sun and included a heating system called a hypocaust. This system used water heated in furnaces under the raised floor of the baths. The resulting steam was channeled under the floors and in the walls. The mechanism was extremely efficient. After the decline of the Roman Empire, the technology behind this innovation seemed to have vanished from public consciousness, who came to believe that taking baths was a bad idea. It wasn't until the 20th century, in some places in Western Europe, that central heating reappeared. These photos give you an idea of how the exterior of the furnaces were set up in antiquity. As you can see in the image on the left, there were at least 3 separate furnaces based on the fact that there are 3 entrances. Slaves would have hauled wood at least, and possibly water, since I don't know whether the water was piped into the area, along with themselves down those inclines. The right-hand photo is a detailed view of the ramp leading downhill to make it easier to carry in the wood, and the entryway to one of the furnaces. This image from Wikimedia Commons gives you an idea of the shape and decorations of the first room of the bath complex, which is now called the biapsidal hall. That name just means there were apses on each end of it. We would think of it as an entrance foyer. The original roof, of course, is long gone, along with most of the frescoes, which must have lavishly livened up the space, but the mosaic floor survived. The mosaic on the floor shows us a Circus Maximus chariot race held to honor Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. Since this entire estate was at its heart an agricultural enterprise, honoring the goddess of agriculture seems entirely appropriate. A room this large probably did more than just serve as an entrance foyer. Researchers believe it probably housed the gymnasium. Gyms in ancient Rome were much like ours. They were sites where Romans could work out, working up a sweat if they were a part of the leisure class, before relaxing in the baths. People socialized here as well. Roman bathing rituals were at least as complicated and choreographed as court etiquette in the time of Louis XIV, except at the end, those enjoying it emerged not only exercised but clean. Romans would visit the different rooms in a specific order. They might start in the apoditarium, or dressing room, where they could undress and leave their clothing, which would be either watched over by a personal servant or a slave. Next up was the gymnasium, where we are now, and where they could exercise, and then have their bodies oiled before they went into the baths themselves. This is a detail of the mosaic floor we already saw, showing a chariot racer complete with a driver and either a helper or a fan behind him. Notice that the chariot racer is riding rather dangerously, in my opinion, holding on to nothing, but with one arm raised to use his whip. After the gymnasium are Roman. Males and females use the same facility, although at separate times would have needed to cool down. The next stop was the frigidarium, or cold room, and this is the Latin word from which we got our trade name Frigidaire. It contained a cold plunge bath. I think it would have been unheated and quite brisk, especially in the winter. To the Romans, violent changes in temperatures weren't a bug in their system. They were a deliberate feature. A gymnasium might provide slightly different facilities and activities depending on the size of the room, the wealth of the owner, and who exactly was visiting. Women like our friend Flavia might have exercised, or perhaps given her age, merely engaged in the more aesthetic procedures offered, including a deep massage. Aside from things like lifting weights, male visitors might engage in wrestling matches, sometimes under the supervision of trainers. This depicts 2 men. On the left, the man carrying the bucket might have been one of those trainers or another servant, and the bucket could have contained scented water or scented oil. The man on the right is harder to identify, but I believe the object in his hand might have been a strigil or scraper used in the massage portion of the proceedings. This is a section of the mosaic floor in the frigidarium, or cold room of the villa. Notice that dark spot in the center toward the top of this image? That's the drain for what once would have been a plunge pool. I'm not sure how long a Roman would have lingered here in an unheated pool, in an unheated room in the middle of winter. I finished massaging my mistress, and she visited, although only briefly, the cold room. She's much more eager to see the warm room and the hot room. These two photos show you what currently have been identified as part of the tepidarium or warm room and the coldarium or hot room. On the left is possibly part of the tepidarium, showing how the floor is heated from underneath by the hypocaust system. On the right is part of what might have been a coldarium or hot room. This would have been the last stop inbound for the baths, where guests would have indulged in a hot bath, then worked their way back through the rooms in reverse order, finishing where they began, in the changing room. I will let my mistress, Flavia, tell you the rest of the story. We've finished our bath. My servant Yudit, whose name means young despite her great age, and I might add ever complaining, was with me every step of the way, although as a servant she will have to bathe separately. I am tired now, and so is she, although she's far too stubborn probably to ever admit it. Perhaps she still believes that her name, when translated, means young. Tomorrow is an important day, and much rests on my discussion with the Dominus about the sale of the farm. Perhaps I will be able to retire to a warmer area of the island, where my pains from the cold will grow less. I will be a woman with rights and money, and I will keep Yudit with me. I have already made arrangements for her to be freed after my death, and this sale means I will not only be able to free her, but to provide for her as well. For now, however, I shall retire to one of the guest apartments assigned to us to sleep. Tomorrow we'll see the rest of the building before meeting with the master in his audience chamber. Afterwards, I have been invited to join the other guests for a midday meal. My servant will attend me. Yudit is going to explain about these rooms. Guesswork goes into identifying rooms created so long ago when no documentation about exactly what they might have been survives, and probably none ever existed. Contemporaries would have known what the rooms were used for based on what they saw at the moment and how they were decorated, just as we distinguish, for example, a dining room from a living room, partly based on the furniture. In the end, all these spaces were rooms. The rooms now identified in the peristyle as guest apartments were luxuriously decorated and no doubt equally luxuriously furnished in their day, although all of the latter has long since vanished. The clue that these were more than just service rooms is in the decoration. On the left you can see a hunting scene. The mosaic in the center is a fishing scene. The photo on the right is of the floor of another of these rooms whose mosaic has sadly disappeared. Was it another guest room, slave quarters, a business place, a place to store onions? Because the furnishings and decorations are gone, we don't know. The impressions and graininess on the floor show where the floor tiles might have been. Were they stolen, washed away? No one knows today. Our friends Flavia and Yudit have had quite a long day. They've traveled, arrived, been greeted by a series of increasingly important members of the master's staff, and refreshed themselves. Now the light grows dim, and it is time for them to sleep. I hope you've enjoyed this visit to the Villa Romana del Casale, as seen from the point of view of an invited visitor and her servant. Come back next time and we'll take a look at the rest of this villa here on the Armchair Traveler.